Hi guys, so quite a number of people over the last kind of few months have asked me to talk about why some swords have two edges and why other swords have one edge, and what the strengths and weaknesses of having one edge or two edge are. Well, quite simply, I haven't done a video about this previously because I kind of don't know how to answer it in a way, but I'll mention a few points that hopefully might help some people and might sort of stimulate further conversation. The first thing to say about two edges versus one is that fundamentally, when you're making a sword, a two-edged sword is more difficult to make than a one-edged sword. The same goes for a knife or a dagger as well. Obviously, if you only have one edge, you only have to forge one edge and you only have to maintain one edge. So it's both easier to make and easier to keep and maintain. Why is it easier to make? Well, quite simply, the edge is the sort of the finest bit of the blade, and it's the thing that's most requires the best quality steel. So in earlier periods, a lot of swords utilised better quality steel at the cutting edge, and this was particularly true of knives as well. If you X-ray medieval eating knives, for example, you'll see that they're generally speaking an iron back with a steel edge, or at least a low carbon steel back with a high carbon steel edge, forge welded together. And in actual fact, when they corrode in the ground, you can often clearly see the difference between the hard steel and the soft steel or iron, in the way that they differentially corrode and oxidise. So it's easier and potentially cheaper to make a one-edged sword because, of course, if you're putting more expensive steel, higher carbon steel, on the edges, then, and of course this is how axes were made as well, if you're putting them on two edges, you're putting twice as much of the expensive steel into the sword. However, if you're using a homogeneous folded steel, for example, or a smelted high carbon steel, so you've got one billet of high carbon steel and you're forging the whole blade out of that, it's still easier to make one edge. You just forge only one edge rather than forging two. Equally, it's a lower level of skill is required to forge a one-edged weapon than a two-edged weapon, because getting the blade straight and even and symmetrical with two edges requires more skill and effort and time than doing it with one edge. Equally, when you come to quench and then temper the blade, when you're quenching the steel, various things can go wrong, and if you've got a double-edged straight sword, it's more likely to go bent or more likely to crack at the edges if you've got two edges than a one-edged sword. And in fact, as I've mentioned in previous videos, as we see with Japanese swords, and as I think was the case with certain types of Indian sword as well, often with a one-edged sword you can just quench the edge, you can just quench one cutting edge. If you've got two edges, you can't only quench the edge, you have to quench the whole blade. When you quench a whole blade, there's always a risk of the blade bending to a point where you can use it as a sword without basically without annealing the sword and then trying it again, or in fact just cracking. And a lot of blades do just go ping and snap when you quench them. Less so with modern steels, because modern steels are more homogeneous, reliable, and we can measure the exact temperatures that we're quenching at and so on. But with historical steels, there's often impurities and inclusions in there. There's forge folds, there's a slag potentially, and when you quench historical steel, you're potentially more likely to get this type of fault and this breakage essentially in quenching. So, for making the one-edged knife or sword or dagger is easier to make than the two-edged one, and therefore, because it's easier and takes less time, it's also therefore cheaper. In terms of actual use, predominantly swords are obviously most swords most of the time you're predominantly using what we call the front edge or the true edge. Okay, and just so you know, the front edge is often termed the true edge or long edge, and the back edge is often called the false edge or falso filo in Italian, or sometimes known as the short edge. The reason why they're sometimes called long edge and short edge, mostly in modern HEMA and in German, is because in Germany the Messer was a very popular common people's weapon, and of course a Messer looks like a falchion, and it has a long edge on one side and it has a clipped back with a false edge, like a giant Bowie knife, on the back. So it has a long edge and a short edge. So the actual use between one-edged and two-edged swords is not hugely different, because of course most of the time in most systems of swordsmanship you're cutting with the front edge, and if you're cutting, say you're cutting only with the front edge, then having two edges really makes no difference. The only possible advantage there might be that if your front edge gets kind of dull, i.e. blunt, you can of course turn the sword around and use your second sharp edge as well. However, some systems of fighting do make use of the back edge in these kind of upwards rebatting, as we would call, or upwards cutting motions. Okay? Now, in actual fact, a lot of single-edged swords have what we call, and I've just mentioned it, the false edge or short edge up at the top. So in actual fact you can still do these things with many types of so-called one-edged sword. Most people would describe a Messer as a single-edged sword, but in actual fact it does have two edges. It's just that one edge is a full edge and the other one is just up here where you need it. You don't need a back edge down here. So in actual fact lots of single-edged swords do actually really have two edges, but of course there are many swords which do truly only have one edge. For example, a katana or a Chinese dao or a Burmese da, all of these sort of things. So, and in fact, you know, certain types of European backsword as well. Some of them don't have a false edge, and some types of sabre don't have a false edge. And in these cases, very simply, if you cut one direction, you can't just do this with the back edge. You have to turn the hand to cut back up again. So if you look at Japanese kenjutsu drills, for example, you'll often see situations where they'll cut down with the front edge, turn the blade, and then cut up with the front edge again. Whereas in European longsword, we might go down with the front edge and back up with the back edge, which is very slightly quicker. However, in that case, in the case of the Japanese sword, you can't really make a two-edged Japanese sword because the geometry wouldn't work. The Japanese sword is specifically designed, and indeed the metallurgy of it is specifically designed to have a hard cutting edge. Only the edge, that's why you get the hamon line of course, only the edge is truly hardened, leaving a softer back for the resilience, and all of the thickness and strength of the Japanese sword is at the back of the blade, and so you can have a very shallow angle and sort of gradient to the edge. And this is the other point I would come on to. So one of the other differences of course between a double-edged sword and a single-edged sword is you can have different types of geometry with them. Theoretically, you can have a more shallow angle to the edge with a one-edged sword than you can do with a double-edged sword. Because if you think about it, for the sword to have a certain degree of stiffness, it either has to be hugely broad, which isn't usually the case, or it has to have a certain degree of thickness. And with a double-edged sword, that thickness is placed in the centre of the blade. That means you have to get from, say, 1 centimetre thick, or say, let's say 6 millimetres thick, 6 millimetres thick to an edge, in half as much distance as with a single-edged sword of the same width. With a single-edged sword, if it was 6 millimetres at the back, the angle is much more shallow to get to the edge. So something like a tulwar, for example, tulwars are very thick at the back of the blade, but the edges can often be very, very fine. And that means that you can have a very shallow gradient coming away from the edge if you want to have one. And therefore, potentially, you could argue that you can have not sharper swords, but potentially better cutting with less resistance swords, which have a single edge rather than a double edge. Okay, and lastly, the last thing I'll say about single edge versus double edge is quite simply, once you get developed hilts coming along, like basket hilts or rapier hilts or side sword hilts, anything with a knuckle bow, in other words, anything that's asymmetrical, the sword at that point, whether it has two edges or one, kind of becomes a monodirectional sword anyway. Okay, so there are certain, for example, the backsword, it's almost certain that the backsword became so popular in the 17th and 18th century because basket hilts had come along. And if you look at the earliest basket hilts, nearly all of them that I've seen and documented, have been double-edged. Okay, so originally the medieval sword blade was retained and the basket hilt was added to it. But once you have a basket hilt, you can't turn the sword around. Okay, so if you can't turn the sword around, why go to all that extra time, expense and effort to make two long edges? And that's of course what they stopped doing. They thought, okay, well we can make a backsword cheaper than we can make a broadsword being a two-edged basket-hilted sword. So backswords became very popular, of course, because you can only use the edge pointing forwards, or at least the long edge. Some of them have a short false edge, but you can predominantly only use the front edge most of the time because you have a basket hilt dictating which way around the sword is held. So of course there's no point most of the time having two edges on a basket hilt. Although of course they were retained, and two-edged basket hilt swords did persist, especially in Scotland. In England, backswords predominated over broadswords, whereas in the Highlands of Scotland the broadsword, the double-edged broadsword, was generally speaking more popular, I think, than the backsword. Okay, the backsword being a single-edged sword. So there we go. There's many more things, I'm sure, and feel free to discuss it in the comments and come up with more questions and more ideas. But generally speaking, I think these are some of the main ideas around single-edged versus double-edged. It's a matter of how long it takes to make, cost, maintenance, whether you actually need one edge or two edge, and then finally, and the way that the sword is made in terms of having different types of steel and different types of heat treatment, and finally the introduction of complex hilts which force you to hold the sword only one way around in any case. Okay, and the other thing to remember is that many so-called single-edged swords, like backswords, often do have, or messers, often do have a false edge up here, so they can still cut with the back. Cheers!